Oh hey, don't mind me, I'm just starting arguments online. People aren't fighting in the console wars like they used to, and I'm sick of it. Nowadays people are all cross-play this and multi-platform that. I'm working hard to bring back the good old days, when you could call someone a bitch just for owning a GameCube, damn it. Which console are you gonna get? For some, there's no bigger question. Nothing else could possibly be as important as this decision.
What should we name our son?
In a minute, honey. These things are expensive, and each one has a whole host of exclusive games. And for a while, online multiplayer meant that you had to make sure you got the same console as the rest of your friends. Do you really want to miss out on Halo with the boys just so you can play Little Big Planet? These days, however, cross-platform multiplayer is becoming much more common, and a lot of these exclusives end up going multi-platform eventually. Usually they get ported over to PC, but occasionally they even break the sacred console barrier. Not to worry though, Nintendo's working hard to keep the console war alive and well, so make sure you lob a Joy-Con at your nearest Xbox fan for them. And just like any war, nothing matters except the winners, so let's take a look at the top 10 best-selling consoles of all time. The Game Boy Advance was the definitive handheld. Nintendo had already been dominating the handheld market for years, but the GBA was a huge upgrade in every way over its predecessor. These graphics were amazing for the time. This looked like a Super Nintendo game, but on the go. Hell, quite a few SNES games were even straight up ported over to the GBA. The SNES was pretty old by this point, but these games still held up. Those who played them back in the day were amazed that they could fit them in their pocket, and those that didn't got to experience the classics when they otherwise might not have given them a chance. Even though the original GBA still didn't come with a backlight, they did release the SP model a few years later, which did. This quickly became the ideal GBA. But to be honest, I still kind of prefer the original design. I think the only reason the GBA isn't further up on the sales ladder is because so much of its library was just ports of older games, as well as a ton of these licensed kids games. These ports are great, and there were a few great games out there made specifically for the GBA, but they were simply outnumbered by the trash. The Xbox 360 was an excellent console. The original Xbox was pretty good, but it resulted in a huge loss for Microsoft when all was said and done. Luckily, they still saw potential in the Xbox brand and followed up with a real banger. This was the first real HD console, beating the PS3 to market by almost a full year. Technically, the original Xbox could output 720p, but it required you to buy extra component cables, and only a handful of games supported it. The 360, however, could do HD right out of the box. Now, I've already talked at length about the experience of the 360, but so many great gaming franchises got their start here, many of which are still going today. And that's on top of the spotlight on indie games through XBLA pushing the indie scene to a larger audience. Despite some now infamous problems with its launch model, the 360's early start and its more focused marketing gave it a really good head start over the PS3. I mean, for a while it felt like basically everybody had one of these things. Anyway, I wonder what number 8 is. Yeah, surprisingly, despite how well the 360 did, Sony managed to pull ahead just a little bit in the end. Sony was pretty cocky after, spoiler for later in this episode, the massive success of the PS2. Early on in this generation, they must have felt like gods. That's the only explanation I can come up with for some of the shit they pulled. Some of the ads they ran for this thing are ridiculous. They'd be hilarious if they weren't meant to seriously convince me to buy a PS3. And the first prototype of this thing was insane. Yes, the controller looks f***ing stupid, but I don't even care about that. What could they possibly expect us to do with 3 Ethernet ports? They did ground the design a little bit by the time it actually launched, but still, the high price and the bizarre advertising turned off a lot of consumers, and the overly complex CPU architecture turned off a lot of developers. Once Sony cleaned up its act by dropping the price and focusing its advertising on being not crazy though, the more powerful hardware in the PS3 ended up pulling them ahead and allowed them to win the 7th generation of console wars. Now let me just take a look at my list to see what number 7 is, and goddammit, it's the Wii. The Nintendo Wii. I'm shocked this one's so far down the list. For a while after this thing launched, people lost their damn minds. Everyone had to have one. It didn't matter if you were young, old, or dead. Dead people must have loved this thing. No one with a pulse could possibly stomach Eminem's kart racing. Yeah, alright. And of course, the Wii was the launch of the ever-controversial motion control craze. To this day, we're still dealing with the consequences. But while the Wii managed to gain a ton of momentum early on thanks to its casual appeal and the fact that no one could get one so everyone wanted one, it didn't manage to keep that up throughout the generation. It eventually became clear to the core gaming audience that the 360 and the PS3 were the serious video game machines, while the Wii was more like a toy for the casual audience. an audience that was lost forever in 2007 once they discovered Netflix. Though unlike most consoles, thanks to the older hardware and an optimized manufacturing process, Nintendo actually did make a profit on console sales. I'm sure they would have liked to push some more software sales, but I guess instead they'll just have to settle for winning the console war with cheap, outdated hardware. Sony knocked it out of the park with their first foray into the console market. It just goes to show how powerful spite can be. Sony produced the sound chip for the SNES and later partnered with Nintendo again to create an add-on for the SNES that would allow it to play CDs, with plans for Sony to even release games on CDs. This came to be known as the Nintendo PlayStation, a name that makes me break out in hives just from thinking about it. Throughout the development of the SNES add-on, Nintendo felt they were giving too much control over to Sony and eventually decided to cut ties and partner with Philips to create the CDI instead. The whole thing on Nintendo's side led to the creation of some of their worst games of all time, and on Sony's side it led to a brand new console that blew both the N64 and the Sega Saturn out of the water. I'll let you figure out who won that one. Sony was famously able to beat Sega on price, and while the N64 was a fine console in its own right, the severely limited file size of its cartridges compared to the CDs used with the PlayStation, combined with less than stellar third-party support, meant a lot of formerly Nintendo exclusive franchises ended up jumping ship. Sony was humbled by the initial failure of the PS3, and even though they managed to turn that around, they were determined not to repeat the same mistakes with their next console. Development of the PS4 reportedly started as early as 2008 as Sony didn't want Microsoft to beat them to market again. By this point, the console market had long since consolidated into three main players, and since Nintendo was busy doing this, Sony's only real competition was coming from Microsoft. Luckily for Sony, Microsoft seemingly spent their entire marketing budget on making the Xbox One look as unappetizing as possible. It was always online, the Kinect was mandatory, they locked out used games, and all of that was if they even remembered to mention the thing was a game console. Sony's marketing team had the easiest job this generation. All they had to do was point across the aisle and say, "We're not doing that," and people lined up to buy a PS4. Much like the PS3 though, Microsoft did manage to turn things around a bit for the Xbox One. They walked back a lot of their more controversial decisions before launch and the rest afterwards. And after they brought out features like backwards compatibility and Game Pass, it actually became a pretty worthwhile console. Unlike the PS3 though, it wasn't enough to catch up to Sony in terms of raw unit sales. Coming in at number 4 is the original Nintendo handheld, the Game Boy. Now there is an argument for the Game Boy and Game Boy Color being split up as two separate consoles, so don't worry Scott, I hear you. But all of the reported sales figures for these two are combined, which probably helped it secure such a high spot. That doesn't mean it was any less ubiquitous though. I never had a Game Boy as a kid, but I remember seeing all the other kids playing with them in the schoolyard and getting real jealous. The Game Boy was a pretty simple machine, even by the standards of 1989. Nintendo's president at the time, Hiroshi Yamauchi, encouraged the use of older existing technology in new and innovative ways rather than relying on brand new cutting-edge tech. Which is why the original Game Boy shipped with no backlight and a monochrome display. Not only did it help keep costs down, but it resulted in a much longer battery life, making it far more appealing than the other handhelds on the market at the time. Now what a comeback story. Nintendo went from a paltry 13 million sales of the Wii U to making the third best selling console of all time, and it's still going. Once again, Nintendo's strategy of using proven technology in innovative new ways paid off. They took the Wii U's idea of taking your games off the TV screen and asked, what if we went further with it? Literally, you can just go further now. Try to play your Wii U in the woods, you can't do it. There were claims thrown around that handhelds like the PSP and the Vita gave you console quality games on the go, but I think the Switch is the first handheld to truly deliver on this. Sure, a lot of Switch games don't look as good as their contemporaries on the big boy home consoles, but there are also plenty of absolutely gorgeous games on the Switch that feel right at home on the big screen in the living room. Taking those games on the go wherever you want is truly amazing. Nintendo knew that a hybrid console like this was a risk, that's why they claimed the Switch wouldn't replace the 3DS. That way they could fall back on it if the Switch flopped. Once it became clear that everyone and their dog loved the Switch though, it didn't take long for the 3DS to be left in the dust. Nintendo did the same thing with the DS. Even though it was fully backwards compatible with GBA games, they claimed it was meant to coexist with the GBA. Speaking of which, Nintendo revolutionized the handheld gaming space with the Nintendo DS for the third time in a row. God, do something different for once! Much like the Wii, the DS captured a much wider audience than other consoles with its unique and easy to understand control methods and a good library of more casual games. Unlike the Wii though, the DS also came with a pretty huge upgrade in graphical quality compared to the GBA. We had fully 3D visuals on a handheld. This is incredible. Look at that, it's Mario 64. That's a console game. We have console quality games on the go, said people who haven't played a console game since 1996. The 3D on this thing was pretty rudimentary, but still, for the time it was impressive. Even though it was less powerful than the PSP, which came out about a year later, the great library of games plus backwards compatibility with the existing GBA library was enough to push the DS way up the charts. That, and I'm sure a few people might have double dipped on this one. There were quite a few redesigns throughout the DS's life, plus some of these things got abused pretty hard. I feel like almost everyone has some wacky story about how they broke their DS. Ah shit, this isn't Nintendogs. To this day, the undefeated champion of unit sales is still the PS2. And it's no wonder this thing sold like crazy. It had everything you needed from a console at the time. Killer exclusive games, a huge graphical leap over the last generation, and probably most importantly, it could play DVDs. DVDs were still pretty new at this time, and DVD players were pretty expensive compared to even just a few years later, pretty much bottoming out around $300. So when the PS2 launched at $299 with DVD compatibility, it was so much easier to convince Dad to stick it in the living room. But the main leg up the PS2 had was its track record of not f***ing up as much as the competition. The Xbox was too expensive to manufacture and wasn't able to make up for it with software sales, and the GameCube. Hello and welcome to What the Fuck is Wrong with the GameCube, the show that takes beating a dead horse to a whole new level. We've been on the air for 23 years straight and our contestants are still ready to go on those buzzers, so tell me folks, what the fuck is wrong with the GameCube? It's too small. It's too square. No backwards compatibility? This controller looks like it was made by Jackson Pollock. I just prefer the ColecoVision. These discs are tiny. You can't play Get Smart. I just don't like the fucking thing. Now the GameCube was a fine console, damn near a good one even, but the use of proprietary mini DVDs severely limited its third-party support. The more limited file size meant that when multi-platform games did hit the GameCube, they often had content cut in order to make room on the disc. Combined with the inability to play DVDs and the fact that it hit the market almost a full year after the PS2, it just wasn't as appealing for most people. I guess when you really look back, most of these consoles did at least have something that made them worthwhile. Even the flops like the Wii U or the original Xbox taught a valuable lesson that led Nintendo and Microsoft find much better success later on. At the end of the day, I think what I've learned over the last 10 minutes or so is that it doesn't matter where you play your games as long as you enjoy them. And that's a lesson that I'll hold with me until I'm unbanned from GameCubeLovers.com.